Welcome to the pod, you curious, you courageous Herle Burly-ites. Let's get right to it because our topic today is elemental. We're going to dig deep into the economy. We're going to talk about the Bank of Canada. We're going to talk about the fight against inflation. We're going to talk about a potential recession. You'll hear about housing and housing policy. You'll hear about unemployment, and underneath it all is this emotional undercurrent. To sum it up, Herle Burly-ites, why does an economy with almost no unemployment feel so goddamn lousy to so many people? Here to help me sound smart on all of that are Dr. Lindsay Tedds and Randall Bartlett. Dr. Tedds is currently Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary. Her primary research is in tax policy, public economics, public policy design, and implementation. She publishes far and wide, and in her own words, it's important that her work be accessible to broader audiences in order to spark conversations about public policy beyond the academic community. So it's not at all shocking that her blog is called Dead for Tax Reasons. Look it up at wordpress.com. Randall Bartlett is Senior Director of Canadian Economics with the Desjardins Group. Based in Toronto, he covers the Canadian and provincial economies and housing markets outside of Quebec, as well as government budgets and fiscal policy. He's got a great weekly newsletter on the economy that's well worth subscribing to. Before Desjardins, Mr. Bartlett was the Director of Economic Research on OMER's Total Portfolio Management team. And he's a frequent publisher on what's on his economic mind on both Twitter and LinkedIn, as well as various other media. So, Lindsay and Randall, welcome to the Herle Burly. Thanks for coming here.
Well, thank you. That's quite the introduction.
It's a real pleasure, David. Thank you so much for having me.
Lindsay, where do I find you today?
I'm in Calgary. Is that what you mean?
You're in Calgary. Okay, I know people move around, and this is virtual. You're in Calgary?
Yes, I'm in Calgary, yeah.
All right, and where are you at, Randall?
I'm in Toronto today at my place in East York near the Danforth.
Okay. Are you spending a lot of time in Montreal these days?
Not as much as I'd like, to be honest. I love Montreal. It's a wonderful city, but no, we're just so busy here in Toronto. I mean, our team based here on Bay Street services all of Canada outside of Quebec. So we've got our hands full with that. Right.
Yeah, I partial to Montreal, Lindsay, but not so much to Calgary. Calgary's not been very kind to me over the years. Calgary, in fact, has been mean to me over the years.
Yeah, it's an acquired. I mean, I've only been here for 5 years. But I was in Victoria for 11 years before here. But I grew up a military brat, so I Rolling Stone gathers no moss. So we'll see where I go next.
You were never in Moose Jaw, were you?
Yes.
Did you grow up in Moose Jaw?
No, I didn't grow so we moved every year. So yeah. Moose Jaw, but we mostly followed the Four Field Hospital. And so I lived in Europe. I've lived all across Canada, but never for anywhere for very long. So I don't have a lot of clutter.
You know that Burton Cummings from the Guess Who lives in Moose Jaw?
Is that right?
Yes, he does. Yes.
So I have a bit of a warm spot for Moose Jaw. We did a family cross-country trip a few years ago and went to see the tunnels of Moose Jaw and saw a couple of shows there. It's actually a pretty fun little town. I had no idea. I recommend it to everybody who's doing
El Capone Sanctuary, the tunnels.
That's right. That's right.
Presumably you had a luxurious bath in the mineral spas.
We did. We certainly did. Yeah. It's quite the place. Quite the place.
All right, let's talk some economics. So the context for the conversation I want to have with you is that there's some very confusing things going on in the economy, or at least confusing to me. Growth is higher than expected, and I would have thought that was a good thing because we're coming out of the COVID shutdown of our economy stronger than people expected that we would. Unemployment's at record lows, and yet most people feel like they're falling behind, and food bank usage is skyrocketing among people with full-time employment. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates to try to get inflation to 2%, despite the feeling by many economists that they don't have the tools to deal with this particular inflation. as generated mostly by international factors. And while interest rates go up, Canadians continue to consolidate their position as the world's most indebted people. Highest personal debt in the world with interest rates rising. Doesn't feel to me like that will end well. So I kind of want the two of you to try to demystify all this for me, because it doesn't even feel like you know what direction policy should be going, because things seem to be pushing and pulling in different directions. Let's start with the Bank of Canada. Last week it raised its rates and it signaled it's going to raise them again pretty clearly. I know what Randall thinks about this, but I don't know what you think about it, Lindsay. So why don't we start with you? Did they make a good decision last week to raise rates?
Well, in a year from now, I'll tell you the answer to that. But I'm going to be in the camp of economists who were surprised that they went ahead with that rate hike. We thought there would very much be a pause because we are seeing some, as you're saying, like the signs right now are all over the place, right? We've got a lot of volatility. We've got a lot of uncertainty. We're not seeing wage growth. Yes, unemployment is low, but wage growth is not there. We've got productivity problems. Well, Canada's always had a productivity problem. Business investment is not keeping up with expectations as well. So, it reading the tea leaves right now, it is really, really hard to do. The thing with the Bank of Canada, though, is they have a mandate that they have to follow. And that is they have this inflation target of 2% put in place in 1991 after 2 decades of real inflationary problems from the 70s and 80s. And it certainly is not, it was renewed in 2021, right? I think it was December 21, but maybe Randall, you know better. It was before we sort of really had a lot of this inflationary pressure. They have to keep inflation low. They have no other choice. It's their mandate. But it is not clear that was a very good move in terms of dealing with all of these issues that you talked about, David. I mean, it's mortgage rates. I think people are very much struggling. Although the stress test, I think we're seeing why we brought in that stress test. But yeah, it was
genius. OSFI saved us a lot of pain. Hey?
Yeah. Yes.
Peter Routledge. There should be a little bust on a mantle somewhere for Peter Routledge.
Yeah. But we're going to start really seeing the impact of that soon, because it seems that people didn't really read their amortization schedule of what all of these things means in terms of how much is going towards your principal. So yeah, people who are carrying debt are in a really tough place. People who have savings, I'm loving the 6% I'm getting on my high income savings account. So, different people are going to feel this in a different way. But for the most part, it's going to hurt young families very much.
Randall, how important is this 2% target?
Well, I'm in the camp that thinks that 2% target is very important for the Bank of Canada. I mean, the Bank of Canada's mandate is to keep inflation low, stable, and predictable, and so that people can plan, so that we don't erode the incomes of those earning fixed incomes that tend to be the lower income or seniors, that sort of thing, right? So we want to have stable, predictable inflation in Canada, and so I think it's very important. Now, there's been a little bit of discussion around whether or not the Bank of Canada should consider adjusting its mandate, and maybe that's a discussion for the next mandate renewal once they wrestle inflation back to 2%. But it's very important for them to maintain the credibility that they can get inflation to remain stably around 2%. And so,
okay, but what if I was to say to you, Randall, what other economists say, which is that so much of our inflationary pressure is international and outside of the scope of the Bank of Canada's interest rates. And if you actually look at the impact of the Bank of Canada's interest rates, it's a mixed blessing on inflation, because it's driving up inflation in the housing sector at a minimum, while it depresses inflation in other sectors in the country. So, I mean, is this a situation where the inflationary pressures are so unique from what was anticipated that the bank's mandate's out of step, perhaps, with reality?
Yeah, I would agree that there's certainly some of that. Now, when you look at where inflation really started to come alive back in the early part of last year, that was a function of the fact that we had a lot of these international pressures. We had global supply chain constraints, a lot of income chasing after scarce goods, and people weren't spending on services because they were on lockdown. So that's really where you started to see that pressure. Then you have the war in Ukraine on commodity, pushing up commodity prices, and you have the implications for food prices. And so really services were the last sort of price category to really start to pick up. Now you're seeing some of those international constraints coming off. You're seeing that energy prices are negative on a year-over-year basis. Commodity prices are starting to cool. They're still rising on a year-over-year basis, but they're starting to decelerate. So now what the Bank of Canada is really focused on are our core services. And one of the measures that they're putting a lot more focus on these days is core services excluding shelter. So taking out the impact of the interest rate hikes on inflation. And that's really what they're concerned about, because that's staying, around the range of 4 to 4.5% for about the last 6 to 8 months, and really is just moving sideways. And for the bank, that's a signal that, they really haven't done enough. Now, there were a lot of contributing factors. GDP came in stronger than expected. We have a slight uptick in headline inflation. The housing market seems to be rebounding as well. And so there are a lot of other factors that played into their decision. But a big part of that is that core services excluding shelter is just moving sideways. And so they really want to start to wrestle that back down to around 2% on average, which is where it was prior to the pandemic.
What's in that services bucket? I keep asking economists, explain this to me. What's in that services bucket, and why do I care if there's inflation in there? I mean, is this restaurants or is this financial services? What is this?
Yeah, so it's financial services, it's restaurants, it's travel, it's recreation, it's basically everything that you consume as a shelter, even energy related service costs. So everything you consume as a service that is excluding shelter. So it's almost everything you do that's not ordering something on Amazon or something like that, right? So it's all of those things. And what we see in the data, and this is where I think the Bank of Canada was really surprised, and I know we were, is that in the first quarter of the year, we saw that Canadians were still. They're going out to restaurants, they're going to shows, like they're still spending in a way, even in real terms, after you adjust for inflation, in a way that I don't think anybody would have anticipated, particularly the Bank of Canada with interest rates where they are today.
So who's spending? I don't believe you can say Canadians are spending, because I'm just seeing so much data that indicates that most families are under tremendous pressure and are cutting back on essentials. Right? They're not going out to fancy dinners and paying exorbitant rates. So who? Do we have a division, Lindsay, that you can identify about who's having the roaring 20s right now and who's in the 30s already?
Well, it's households like mine that are actually in their spending, right? I mean, it was households like mine, high income households, white collar jobs, all of that kind of stuff. We were the ones who got all that pent up savings during the pandemic because there was nothing to do.
Right.
And so, it's all sitting there, and I liken it to pent up demand, right? It's the travel, like people are, even though travel costs are quite high and travel is unpredictable from a service level quality, people are really getting back into that travel side. When we're talking about eating out, most of it is not in that high end restaurants. It's actually in that more I don't know what the right word is, but we're not going to tablecloth kinds of restaurants with silverware and tasting menus. We're going back into the restaurants of good quality food, but not overly expensive, which means that we can spend more across a variety of different areas. Those are two that come to mind, but it is very much people, again, who have this pent up savings from the pandemic. And it is not necessarily the lower income people who are very much struggling. I mean, for me, our household, the thing we've noticed the most and felt the most has been food costs, dramatically so. Almost doubling, right? I mean, food is expensive now. And we're just seeing a lot of affordability problems in that lower income sort of category, because it's really, really hard to, have an expense like food double as quickly as it has. So yeah, it much like the pandemic hurt different people in different ways. This economy that we're right now is not being felt the same way by different kinds of households.
Healthcare delivery. When Canadians ruminate on what it means to be Canadian, it's way up on the list, eh? 3 notches above poutine, 1 notch below collector of the complete works of Farley Mowat. Last week here, I was talking about how our presenting sponsor, TELUS, invests in the Canadian economy through the lens of social purpose, addressing some of the biggest social challenges we all face as a collective. And I left you with this teasing generalized sentence: how we modernize our healthcare and get better access to it. All right then, let's put that statement into our Herle Burly metaphoric MRI machine so we get a much clearer picture of it. For more than 15 years now, TELUS Health has been investing and innovating to reimagine the way healthcare is delivered to and experienced by Canadians. So digital health services like virtual care, home health monitoring, collaborative health records, benefits and pharmacy management tools, and personal medical alert systems. That's the what. The how is that more than ever before, TELUS Health has connected these products and services, breaking down the old, dilapidated healthcare silos so that the flow of information, productivity, and efficiency are dramatically increased among all participants in the value chain: physicians, pharmacists, health authorities, allied healthcare professionals, insurers, employers, and you Herle Burly-ites who need the care in the first place. It's making a difference. When it comes to total well-being across physical, mental, and financial health, TELUS Health serves 5.2 million virtual healthcare members. They've managed more than 580 million digital health transactions. TELUS Health has also supported $600 billion worth in pensions and savings, and they continue to provide invaluable support to employers, ensuring the well-being of their workforce. And with the acquisition of LifeWorks, TELUS Health's innovative approach to addressing people's total well-being has now expanded globally, supporting 67 million lives and organizations in 160 countries. It's an Invest in Canada story that's grown exponentially, Herle Burly-ites. Find more at telus.com/health. Yeah, Randall, I want to come back to this. I want to push you on this because I really want to understand this, and I don't. So why, if I am price insensitive about restaurants or travel because I'm got money, why is the Bank of Canada concerned enough about my price insensitivity on a few items to crush other people who aren't making those decisions?
Well, you've got to think that the Bank of Canada essentially has one tool at its disposal. Now, it has other tools for crisis management, liquidity management purposes. Used quantitative easing during the pandemic, early days, and then quickly backed away from it. So, really, the tool that the Bank of Canada has to manage inflation in the economy is the short-term interest rate. And by raising and lowering it, the intent of that is to make credit more expensive, thereby cooling economic activity as it raises it more, and ultimately that feeds in to cooling core inflation. But the problem is the Bank of Canada can't just target those households where it wants to reduce their demand or their ability to actually make those purchases. And so it's a broad sweeping tool. Now, generally, households that do tend to have larger mortgages and those that are more likely to own do tend to be more affluent households by and large. It tends to be lower income households, younger households that are more likely to rent, for instance. And so it will impact those households. But certainly, to Lindsay's point, and those households have enormous amount of excess savings built up during the pandemic. You look at the U.S., like we have better data there. The distribution is entirely skewed to the upside of the income and wealth distribution, and so it is going to take time for those to go worn down and actuing return to something.
So we have a wealth-driven boom that is going to raise the borrowing costs on non-wealthy people, right? That's basically what's happening. Is wealthy people you're telling me wealthy people are creating creating a boom in spending that's driving inflation, and the whole population has to pay for that?
Well, it's certainly it's everyone who's going to be paying for it, certainly through higher borrowing costs. There's no question there, but certainly it is those who've been able to build up a lot of savings during the pandemic, and certainly who saw their incomes potentially go up as well during the pandemic and during a period of high inflation that followed, as their wages were more likely to be adjusted for a higher inflation as well. So certainly those who are higher income, higher wealth are better positioned to handle the current high interest rate and inflation environment than those folks that aren't. I mean, that's quite frankly, that's the way it often goes through an interest rate hiking cycle, unfortunately.
Yeah, we have to remember we have fiscal policy, right? So, I mean, the Bank of Canada is very constrained. I mean, it's a blunt tool, and certainly was not a very good tool early on in the pandemic, early on in the interest rate rise, because it was things that weren't going to respond to that interest rate hike. But we're now in this point where, I mean, something has to give. And so with monetary policy, I always hate it when we have a bit of a dueling monetary fiscal policy. But in this case, we're using our fiscal policy well targeted to lower income individuals. We could be doing more, but if you look at like the GST, HST credit top up, right, well targeted to low income households. We have some provinces doing some targeting as well. So it's not that there isn't some support there, but it's more in that middle, the quote unquote middle class, however you want to define it, who are young, who are dealing with the early stages of a mortgage where they're not making as much progress on principal. They're just really they're just really feeling this to a significant degree. But again, they have an asset behind all of these things. So we do have to be careful about how we sort of present this, because we don't want the government taking over individual households' risk decisions when they have to be making these decisions within the context of interest rates. And while interest rates were low, I mean, interest rates right now are where they are when I first got into the housing market. So it's not the rates that make it unaffordable to own a house. It's housing affordability that is really the problem, because housing is just so expensive that it's that interaction with the rates that is the problem.
So, Randall, building on that, what do you think is the vulnerability of Canadian debt holders right now to this interest rate environment? I mean, mortgages are one thing, but I hang around with mortgage brokers from time to time. I got some friends in that industry, and I don't know if anybody in the last decade has bought a house without getting given a HELOC, a line of credit. It just seemed automatic, right? Get an equity-based line of credit, and you can do something to your house, or you can go on a vacation, or you can buy another property, buy an income property with your line of credit, all kinds of things. Credit was so easy. And now these people are sitting with these things with the rate going up on them. Already in the mortgage business, we've heard about people whose amortizations have gone up to 70 years or something like that, and they're going to have to be ratcheted back to 30 when they renegotiate. So what do you think ultimately is going to be the case for Canadians with debt? I mean, how badly are we going to fare by the end of this?
Yeah, well, I think we have to think about it in almost two time periods. To think about, what could happen over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, and then, a couple of years down the road, right? So over the next 12 to 18 months, it's really going to be a situation, the Bank of Canada continues to raise interest rates, potentially again in July and maybe again, and then keeps rates elevated for a while before hopefully bringing them back down. And so folks who are renewing their mortgages, might be a 5-year fixed or less, or have flexible payment variable rate mortgage, are going to be feeling those increases. And then on their consumer credit on top of that, we're already seeing that consumer proposals are back up beyond the peak that they reached before the pandemic. And so after reaching a very, very low level during the pandemic. And so people are feeling the squeeze, and it is impacting consumers meaningfully. Again, to the point you made earlier, I mean, the distribution of those impacts is very different, right? But we're certainly seeing it showing up in the data that it is happening. But there's a group of those, and you alluded to this, that with fixed payment variable rate mortgages that aren't actually feeling the full impact of monetary policy. So we would have expected the economy to be a lot weaker than it has been a lot earlier, except not everybody is feeling the full impact of those rate hikes. And so they're going to be feeling that impact now it's building on their principal as they extend those amortizations. When they come up for renewal in 2025, 2026, these are people who took out mortgages during the pandemic, then they're going to really be feeling the implications of that. So what we could see is a really prolonged period of very weak consumption in Canada, and potentially weak residential investment as well, just given the fact that households are going to be coming up against this. Lenders are going to ultimately want to get paid. And so they could feel the squeeze of this. And if we look back at the 1990s, what a lot of households did was do anything they could to stay in their homes. And so they cut consumption very deeply. And it was a very prolonged period of economic malaise as a consequence. So I really think that's where the risk is to the downside in this whole situation.
Right. So why did the U.S. take a different course on interest rates today? Are they seeing something different in their economy, or do they make a different judgment?
Well, they have a different mandate, and the Federal Reserve Bank has a dual mandate. So they have to pursue both maximum employment as well as this 2% target, right? So they have a slightly different experience in their labor market.
This renewal, just to stop you for a sec, Lindsay, the renewal you referred to inserted some of that kind of language as kind of obiter dicta in the Bank of Canada's mandate, but didn't include it as their mandate, didn't it?
Correct. I mean, we have been talking about a dual mandate. Like when the mandate was coming up for renewal, there were academic conferences all over the place talking about, what kind of mandate do we want? The dual mandate was mentioned. It wasn't pursued because it's not a perfect thing either, right? It has costs and benefits as well. But in the U.S., their labor market is much softer than ours. They haven't seen necessarily the same boom in their labor market, and I mean that's just one that I happen to know. Randall, I don't know if you have any more data from the United States.
Yeah, well, I think the U.S. today, I mean, they took a pause on rate hikes, but don't forget, Canada took a pause on rate hikes back in January, right? So the Fed has been continuing to hike throughout that period. Took a pause today because inflation in the U.S., as per the metrics they use, has been moving in a more positive direction than it has been in Canada. So they look at similar inflation metrics to us, but because it's been moving in the right direction, they felt they could take a pause. Now, a lot of people are speculating sort of what the Bank of Canada has done. Essentially, it's going to be almost a skip as opposed to a pause, right? So they're going to continue to monitor the data, but they're prepared to hike again. In fact, if you look baked into their forecast today, they're expecting 2 more 25 basis point hikes by the end of the year. So certainly, the Federal Reserve the Federal Reserve Board is signaling that they're ready to hike again anytime if the data doesn't cooperate. And so there's the signal to financial markets is don't get too excited yet because more is coming down the pipe.
I think it bears mentioning that our sponsor, CN, is not subsidized by Canadian taxpayers. It pulls its weight unassisted, if you'll excuse the pun. As a matter of fact, long-haul rail freight is the only mode of cargo transport in Canada that does not enjoy overt or hidden subsidies from government. Government helps pay for the cost of building ships. Airlines are sheltered from competition and operate out of subsidized airports. Trucks roll on roads built and maintained by your taxes. Meanwhile, CN pays the full cost of maintaining and growing a major railroad. It's an efficient, modern, publicly traded company that moves cargo on time, come what may. None of this is a complaint. It's merely a statement of fact. CN is effectively the bedrock of Canada's supply chains. Rail is far more efficient and powerful than any other form of freight transport. 1 ton of cargo moves 4 times farther by train than by truck on the same amount of fuel. 1 300-container train replaces 300 trucks. Moving freight by rail instead of by truck lowers greenhouse gas emissions by up to 75%. This year, and in the past several years, CN has spent billions on its rolling stock, new technologies, crossings, bridges, and tracks, which is to say it takes its responsibility to Canada's economy very seriously indeed. And to repeat, It is not asking the government for financial help. It is, however, asking to be free of government hindrance. Buried in the recent federal budget is a new layer of regulation for Canada's railways that will effectively hand over control of cargo scheduling to multinational shipping companies. It is a well-intentioned effort to improve supply chains, but it will, without question, end up imposing new costs, which will ultimately be passed on to consumers already coping with steep inflation. It's a baffling piece of policy. CN's railroaders do their jobs very well indeed. Can we not just allow them to keep doing it? Can I draw either of you out on a prediction of how high rates will max out at?
The overnight rate or
the bank rate? Yeah. The Bank of Canada.
Where are we right now? I've lost track. Is it four and a quarter?
4.75.
4.75. See, there you go. So 4 3/4. Maybe as high as 5.5. We like to see some real progress in inflation, as Randall was talking about, over the next 8 months. And I think the prediction is that we should start seeing some softening in inflation over that time. So right now that's might be my guess, about 5.5.
Randall?
Yeah, I'm just going to talk my book. I mean, we're forecasting 5, but all the risk is to the upside, right? So I think the Bank of Canada, it's every data release we get is like another decision point almost. It's like, okay, well, what's happening, not just to headline inflation, but we've got all of these sort of plethora of core measures the Bank of Canada's laid on the table. And so we have to read the tea leaves every time, look at GDP, what's under the hood of this, like the labor market, the housing market. So it really is so data dependent. I feel like in a way that it really hasn't been in quite a while, where it's like every individual data point has so much more weight put on it than we've seen in the past. And so it really, the risk is all to the upside. We expect another hike in July, but September, the door is wide open to September as well. And I think the Bank of Canada, now that it's started the hiking cycle again, will do whatever it takes to start getting inflation moving back to that 2% target.
Okay, and I do want to hear from both of you on this. Are we still headed for a soft landing, or is that thing going to feel a little harder when we hit the ground than was anticipated or hoped for?
Like to see data. So it's really hard. What Randall said is right. I mean, I have to admit, right now we're watching more indicators than we normally do, right? Because of how different this experience has been. Is the U.S. going to do something? I mean, the U.S. predictions for economic growth are not great. How much that will affect us? We have to see what's going to end up going on in Europe. Our Chinese relationships, I mean, that's an important one from an economic standpoint. Still looking like a soft landing, but God only knows what somebody somewhere is going to do to throw that all into chaos. Donald Trump, look how markets responded. You just don't know. What's your prediction, Randall? I still say soft landing, but with a confidence interval that's giant.
You know what? We came back from summer vacation last year and ran all of our forecasting models and everything. And we had a first quarter of 2023 was when the recession was going to start. We're going to be putting out a new forecast next week. It's going to show the last quarter of 2023 and the recession is going to start. It just keeps eluding us all the time. But we've kept the same view, and that is that it's going to be short and shallow as a recession. This isn't your mother, your grandmother's recession. Like, we're not going back to the global financial crisis of the early 90s, the early 80s. This is really a rebalancing sort of recession where the labor market cools back down to something which is more in line with trend, where we get inflation back to 2%. We get growth back in line with sort of our long run potential, that sort of thing, where it's really more of a rebalancing sort of recession than something that's going to be felt very deeply. And in fact, over that whole period, we think that wage growth is going to exceed inflation during that period, and we should see some meaningful real wage gains during that period, as wages tend to increase with a lag relative to inflation. And so it's not going to be something which is like a doomsday scenario. And as we were joking around before, there's an economist with a name similar to someone on your production staff who would say we are in for the economic Armageddon. But I don't think that's the case. It's really sort of a rebalancing back towards something that is more sustainable and more in line with that 2% target.
Okay, here's my last question on the Bank of Canada. I'm going to draw both of you into politics, as I must on this show. The leader of the opposition in Canada, potential next Prime Minister of Canada, says that the government's deficits are a significant factor in Canadian inflation rates. So let me ask you this. If you put Jack Welch into Chrystia Freeland's job and he immediately slashed $40 billion of spending out of the government of Canada to balance its budget, would that have any impact on inflation whatsoever?
Not really. I'm not in the camp of somebody who is going to say that fiscal policy was a big driver of the inflation we have had to date. I reserve my opinion to see how it all unfolds going forward. The spending that we did during the pandemic was necessary, and we shouldn't have to argue that at this point in time, right? We've seen enough of the real benefits that came forward from it. And those are long-term benefits. Everybody thinks they're short-term benefits, but no, when you protect people from economic catastrophe that would have happened had we not done that spending, there are long-term benefits that come from that. So I've read all the monetary policy reports, and it's just not being highlighted as being what was driving this inflation, this inflationary period.
But of course, Mr. Poilievre says the bank is in league with the government on this enterprise, so the bank's reports would not be highlighting that.
I remember when they said that the stats can was in the back pocket of the Liberal government. I mean, this is just ridiculous. A lot of the stuff that he says is just absolutely not true. It is false. It is clickbait. It is a simple, easy answer. And if we were to scale back, I mean, the federal government needs to get its fiscal policy house in order. They do need to rein it in. But if you were to go into one budget and cut out $40 to $50 billion worth of spending, that's not an easy thing to do. I was there in Ottawa during Program Review 1 and 2 in the early 90s. This is not simple to do. And so a lot of that spending, you're either going to have to target business subsidies at that level, that magnitude. It's either we've really got to tackle our business subsidies, or we have to get rid of key programs like the Canada Child Benefit. Like, we have to understand the magnitude of that kind of one-shot cut. And if that happens, $40 billion, I'm sorry, we're going into a recession. That's it, because that's where the spending has to come from.
Randall, you got a take on that?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the last part. I won't opine on the politics, but certainly it's I think the latest measures that were introduced had very minimal inflationary impact. I think a lot of good estimates out there have suggested maybe a quarter of the inflation that we're seeing, or we have seen throughout the recovery, is a function of government policy. But at the same time, again, to Lindsay's point, this was an unprecedented situation and an unprecedented policy response that was broadly coordinated globally in a lot of ways. So this is something that we have never seen in human history in terms of the size of the response. Like, it was a wartime type response. And so we couldn't have known the consequences to that per se. Is the inflation now where I have it around 4.5%, coming down from 8%? Is that the largely like the largest negative?
Is a dental care program inflationary?
No.
No, a dental care program isn't inflationary.
No. Why not? It's throwing money into the economy.
It's targeted. Again, it is targeted, and it's actually addressing affordability. And so No. It's like people saying, who's that food prof guy who said the GST, HST credit top up was driving inflation? No, when you give money to people who are, have less than $30,000 of household income, they're spending it on food that they now couldn't afford if they had not have it, right? So this isn't the same sort of thing as, I don't know, Danielle Smith giving my household a $1,500 tax cut. You want to talk about inflationary pressures. What do you think I'm going to be doing with that money? I have no mortgage. I have no debt. $1,500, man. Go out and buy a good bottle of scotch.
We'll do that. All right, this has been all doom and gloom, this conversation, but nonetheless, the economy seems to be growing at a rate that surprises people given the interest rate hikes. So what's going well in our economy? What is driving growth right now?
Not oil. That I can say for sure. I'm not. I mean, services. We've always been like a really big service economy. We, as Randall says, we've been fueling a lot of that part of the economy. I'm not sure what is doing well, but I know oil and gas isn't. Right, we're seeing lots of layoffs. We've got a low. Alberta now is in a deficit situation because of where oil prices are. So yeah, but Randall, maybe you're up on the data more than I am.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, every quarter is a new adventure, right? So in the first quarter of this year, we had, consumption just go through the roof. A lot of it was auto sales. We're still feeling the effects of the pandemic, or people are just receiving the cars that they ordered back in early 2022 as those supply chains unravel. So to get a sense of where the data is just, it's really challenging, and it changes almost every quarter that we see. And so, where are we seeing the strength right now? I mean, we're seeing it on the consumer side. That's still a big part of it. We're still seeing it on the trade side of things as well. So the U.S. economy is still growing also, and so we're still exporting a lot to the U.S. On the manufacturing side of things, again, relates a lot to autos, relates to a lot of supply chains unraveling, and a lot of those back orders starting to come through. Can't last forever, certainly. A lot of these drivers, but we're still seeing a lot of that. But it's also consumer services, and that's not, that's related to, that's more a function of FOMO or something and that sort of thing, as opposed to people having order goods that are finally coming in. And so a lot of surprises. We're all getting it wrong every time. As we forecast the economy, it's always coming in hotter than we expect. The Bank of Canada has the same track record over the last 4 quarters, and so certainly it's a challenge. The one thing that I find really interesting about what we're seeing in the second quarter of the year is just that it has come in so much hotter than everybody expected. That the government strike didn't take a big knock on the economy. We didn't see that the ice storms in central Canada really slowed the economy down at all. And even the wildfires in Alberta in May, it looks like the energy sector is still producing. So it's one of those things where we're seeing just generally the economy is just showing with so much more resilience than I think anybody imagined at this point in the cycle. And then housing is probably going to contribute positively to growth in the second quarter. We've had too much strength in the housing sector as people are jumping back in. So it's anyone's guess how it's going to happen. So, well, that's it. Prices had come down, rents had gone up, and everybody expected rates to start coming down going forward too, right? So when would be a better time? Especially look at the population growth we're having. Demand is surging for all kinds of shelter, and market housing is just one of them.
Yeah, I want to get to housing in just a quick second, but first I've got a bone to pick with you, Randall. I read your report on your last week's economic update, and you talked about Canada's labor productivity continuing to be poor. Do you recall writing that?
I do recall writing that, yeah.
Okay. Are you saying that Canadian businesses are not replacing enough humans with robots? Is that what you're really saying?
To some extent, yeah. I feel like in Canadian businesses are not adopting technologies and new innovations as quickly as they are in other countries. If you compare us to the US, Europe, Israel, Canada needs to do more, I think, in supporting, I think there's a role for public policy to play in helping to support small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the vast majority of Canadian businesses, in adopting new technologies. And I think that's something that we need to see happen in Canada. Often, if there's a then, if there's increased demand, we backfill it with more labor. And so we're seeing now that coming out of the pandemic, we have this short-term shock coming up against a long-term demographic trend, and we're seeing significant labor shortages in part as a consequence of that. And so we need to find ways of encouraging businesses to become more innovative, more productive, and hence ultimately more profitable for them and for the owners and for hopefully the employees who are that much more productive as well.
How do you both feel about the federal government's emerging industrial strategy built around clean technology? And I'm thinking about both the tax credits that are available to electricity producers, et cetera, in the budget, and also the money that's going to Volkswagen and Stellantis. Today we hear Volkswagen is now $16 billion. So what do you think? What do you think about this? I mean, is this a situation where it begs out for industrial strategy, and we've got to pick a lane, and we've got to make a bet, and we've got to hope that bet is successful, and so this makes sense? Or are we just spending a lot of money to have a battery manufacturer in Canada?
Or all of the above. Canada's never set the world on fire with its industrial strategies, right? I mean, it's one of the biggest long running jokes in the federal government. It's always touting the next big thing in terms of, I mean, think of that. It wasn't super lab, super cluster. I mean, they're always all over the place with their industrial strategy. We do need to. A very controversial opinion out here. We do need to shift right into even more so. I mean that I've got no problems with that. I appreciate from a selling standpoint, carbon capture and storage is like a hot topic. Normally, I don't think that policy is a great policy, but is necessary from a political and a political perspective, as well as aiding the shift in the environment. The tax credits have been well touted by other organizations like Smart Prosperity, but tax credits are tricky because you have to make money in order to take advantage of tax credits. So how much this will really help smaller businesses sort of make this adjustment or enter into this market is, I don't know, I'm skeptical. But I think it had to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm skeptical as well. The example I often hear is cucumbers in Newfoundland.
That one,
there's
yes.
this, are we just throwing good money after bad, and we're just sort of we're taking a gamble on this, and the views really differ, right? Like I have some conservative friends who economists who believe that we do need to go the direction that countries like Israel have gone in, pick our spots, push hard at them, and this is the kind of policy that we need to see, whether this is the right area or not. I'm more of the view that we need to identify what our comparative advantages are as a country.
We're in the process of shutting down our comparative advantages in this country.
Well, I think when you look at things like critical minerals, when you look at things like the energy sector, and we're going to be we're still going to be reliant to some extent on the energy sector for economic activity going forward, as is the global economy as we make the transition. What sort of technologies and innovations can we use to actually leverage that? Things like carbon capture and storage, that sort of thing, right? Where I had one analyst tell me, you need to make carbon to capture it. So Canada has almost this natural comparative advantage in actually doing that, particularly if we focus on things like natural gas and liquefied natural gas. And so I think there is space. And I think when we look at like energy production, whether it's hydro, whether it's nuclear, where we actually have a lot of provinces that are actually open to expanding nuclear energy production, whether it's small modular reactors or otherwise. So I think we have all of these areas where we can provide a real advantage. And I think not just from a long-term economic perspective, but I think from a national security perspective, working with the U.S., our European allies, our Asian allies, to make sure that they have energy security, and then we support each other in having broader national security. I think in that context as well. Okay,
cool. Housing. I know that you both think a lot about this, and there's been a fair bit of talk on this podcast about it over the years. I'm really looking for solutions here from you, for recommendations, for because it's the biggest issue it's the issue for the most people in the country, other than the generalized cost of living. This is something that a lot of people are saying, this is really affecting me right now. Either the cost of my home or my inability to access a place I want to live in. And recently in the news, we've seen stories about some of the people who come here, who immigrate here, leaving because of the cost of housing. Nobody seems responsible for this. Nobody seems to have accountability for this. There doesn't seem to be any plan for this that I can discern. And it's not an apprehended challenge 10 years from now that we can think about how we're going to build houses. It's a problem that exists right now. It seems intractable to me. Do you have any way to make it less intractable?
Go ahead, Randall. I'll let you go first on this one.
I think it's one of those challenges where we clearly have significant labor shortages. We're going to be up against much higher cost of aging going forward, particularly healthcare, and so we fund healthcare out of current revenues. So we need to make sure we're generating sufficient revenues to pay for the healthcare of the aging boomers, right? And so we need immigration, and we need immigration at a higher pace than we were bringing them than we had it prior to the pandemic. And so we needed a higher pace of immigration. The question was, what are the broader implications of bringing in so many people at one time into the Canadian economy? And can we supply enough shelter and ensure these people have somewhere to live? And that's really been the challenge we've been up against. I think it's something where this wasn't a coordinated policy, clearly at the federal level, and with other levels of government, it rarely is. And so now we're contending with this issue. When you look at the data, the immigrants that we bring into Canada are generally well-educated, well-connected internationally, highly entrepreneurial, often come with wealth as well. And so these folks are actually very competitive for housing in Canada when they come in, by and large, not everybody, but more so than we've ever seen in the past. And so we are also bringing in a lot of non-permanent residents to help both fill jobs on a short-term basis, whether it's through the temporary foreign worker program or programs like it.
Pay for the cost of our universities.
Or pay for the cost of our universities by bringing in foreign students. Exactly. So then they're really what's driving a lot of the inflow of new people coming into Canada. Now, those aren't folks that are necessarily becoming citizens. Those are folks who are here for a limited period of time to pursue a specific work or education objective. And so, but they're putting upward demand on shelter as well. And so we can't bring enough housing on fast enough to satisfy all of the needs of everyone who's coming in and maintain housing at an affordable level. But I think at the end of the day, the problem that we have is that we can't build sufficient housing in Canada, particularly I think in Ontario and BC, and to a lesser extent Quebec. I think Alberta is probably a little more open when it comes to the city and the province around building. They have more space as well than say cities like Vancouver. But we need to have that openness. If you look at the 1970s, we were building housing at a much higher rate and for a more sustained period of time as the baby boomers came of age than we are now. And so the question is, okay, well, why could we do it then and we can't do it now? Part of it is that we can't sprawl as much as we did before, but also we have a lot of restrictions on density. When you look at the biggest cities in Canada, they're much less dense than a lot of cities in Europe or even in the US that are of similar size. And so what we need to do is focus on finding ways at the municipal and provincial level to encourage a rapid increase in the density of our largest cities.
But presumably not the 500 square foot condos they're building everywhere around me in Toronto.
No, absolutely. When you look at what's been happening with housing in Canada generally, but in Toronto specifically, it's all been tiny condos that keep getting smaller as detached homes keep getting larger, and the cost to buy per square foot, it keeps going up as well. And so these are housing types that generally are more appealing to developers and investors because they're cheaper to purchase. You can certainly find tenants very, very quickly. And so for folks who are looking to buy a second second or third home as an investment property, they're a cheap way to buy in and then build up equity in that home. And so I don't want to disparage investors. I think in Canada, we're in a situation where most of the new housing that comes onto the rental market is privately owned housing and by and large condos. We don't build a lot of purpose-built rentals in Canada anymore, at least not to the extent that we used to. And so I think that's the model that we have now. And so there needs to be, in my view, a lot of changes in zoning to allow for greater density, but also a requirement of larger units, sort of that missing middle, so that we can have young families continue to stay in cities. As now the folks who are leaving our major cities in the fastest are young adults and kids under the age of 1. So because people can't afford to live there anymore and they can't find adequate housing.
Yeah, and it is, like as Randall said, it's a multifaceted problem, right? It's not just one thing that is contributing to this. Vancouver has pushed up against its boundaries. It's got nowhere to go but up. Calgary, we've got everywhere to go. And this is why it's called the sprawl. But we also have to understand changing demographics and how this plays into what we want to think about in terms of housing. We have, we have smaller families. We get married later. We have a lot of Canada is very unique in having actually a good portion of couples that live together, but they live apart. Canada is actually known for this phenomenon. So I think I don't know about you guys. If you watch city council here in Calgary, which I doubt you do, right? We just had a massive debate last week on affordable housing, right? Where council had to reverse itself. Zoning is by far
maybe people can live in the new arena.
Maybe people can live in oh God, don't get me started on that. I'm sorry. That center, that I keep getting corrected on Twitter. It's like, okay.
Maybe Murray will let them live there on the nights when the Flames are not playing.
Oh, God. Yeah. So, I mean, zoning is a really, really big one, but purpose-built rentals, we had, like in the 70s, Randall talks about this, we had a lot of investment in purpose-built rentals, and that was a public policy choice. And since then, we've become completely brainwashed into a single-family home. Right? I mean, the single family home is only 100-year sort of phenomenon. Yeah,
but it's what people want. It is the aspiration.
Because we've made the aspiration, right? I mean, this is what started 100 years ago. And the big driver behind this idea of single family homes was because it was actually more of a religious aspect of not having multiple people living in households because, the women would be at risk from this. And also it was an anti-immigration approach because we only saw racialized immigrants as living in something other than a single family home. So, our public policy since World War II has been on promoting this dream and reality. And we're just coming up on whether or not that is a way for everyone to live. As I said, demographics are changing. We have much more single people that stay longer. We have smaller families, all of this kind of stuff. And people will have different preferences. When we build only to one preference, here we are, right? We've got a massive affordability problem because we only have single family homes.
Right. Well, I didn't hear answers there, you people.
Purpose-built rentals, like zoning. We've got to. There's a big driver.
Yeah, but that all sounds like something that might help somebody 7 years from now.
We've got to start somewhere. Zoning actually would be a very short-term fix. Yeah. As we can start getting more of that missing middle built within a year. We in some cities, we have to look at that short-term rental problem. Toronto has a problem here with a lot of long-term rentals being put into the short-term rental market. And I think one of the things that we have to really do a gut check on is our policies about aging in place. So here I am in a 6-bedroom, four bath house. The approach now to aging is to make sure that people can stay in their house. This is not where I should be living when I'm 80 years old with mobility challenges.
Yeah, but you know what? I've known people who've 80 years old, and when you're 80, you won't want to leave.
I won't want to leave, except I could. My family is facing this. They're in a 2-story house, and one of them is in a wheelchair. There's a lot of housing that you can't use. And so we really should be thinking about how to ensure that we have the right turnover in housing to support people and not just automatically say everybody should age in place. There are other options. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it. What I'm saying is that we need more policies to sort of get people to understand and promote that turnover. And land transfer taxes don't help. While in Alberta, we really don't have them. If you buy $1 million house in Toronto, you're paying, $32,000 in a land transfer tax, right? And so that is not a policy that helps people turn over their housing. It interferes with that decision.
All right. We're almost out of time, and I haven't got to my big question yet.
That wasn't it?
No.
Wow.
No, my big question is really about the economic paradigm that we're operating in and how well it's working. Because a few months ago, I had on this program Neil Hetherington, who runs the Toronto Daily Bread Food Bank. And he told me that usage of the food bank had gone from about 80,000 a month from before COVID to 280,000 now. And that before COVID, most of the people who came in were frankly disabled people who get so little money that they have to rely on food banks to augment themselves. But now, most of the people who are coming have jobs, full-time jobs. And the unemployment rate's the lowest it's ever been in Canada. It's lower than economists told me it could go when I went to economics school in the early 1980s. And yet, if I do a survey, most people will tell me that they are falling behind, not getting ahead, even though they've got a full-time job. So what's happened to our economy that things like the unemployment rate and GDP do not anymore measure how most people are experiencing things?
Well, they never have. Those are measures that have always only represented a portion of the population. It's just that we now engage in much more discourse and discussion about inequality on the basis of, what happened after the financial collapse, for example. The labor markets are, I worked on the BC expert panel on basic income. And one of the things that we were struck by looking at those who live in poverty was that there's two groups that live in poverty. Is one, exactly what you said, people with disabilities, people with multiple barriers, they're on social assistance, and the rates are just shockingly low because we have this paternalistic idea that these people are just lazy, and if they just got off the dust, they earn money. But it's a dialogue that I fundamentally don't agree with, and we really need a better understanding of people who are on income supports, because it's serious and it's important. The other half work almost full time. They generally work. This other half in poverty are, working at least 30 hours a week. They're working at least 40 weeks out of the year, and they are living in poverty. And that is, in fact, also can be addressed through public policy. We need better labor market reforms. We have to stop letting this idea of businesses saying we can't afford to pay a wage. If you can't afford to pay a wage, you're not a sustainable business, right? And so it doesn't help when we bring in temporary foreign workers into a low-wage environment that if we just let the market sort itself out, wages would rise. So we need to stick with our mixed socialistic system. We have a market-based system, but we also have socialistic policies. Those two hand in hand go well, but we have not kept up with labor market reforms, and we do things that don't help the working poor at all. And like I said, temporary foreign workers is an excellent example of that. Wages need to rise, and we really should be doing way more than we are to get that kind of outcome.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Lindsay. And I really don't have much to add to it, except to say that we've come through this, and we've talked about this as an unprecedented period where we had this economic shock, where people, we're losing jobs, we're receiving government benefits for a long period of time, which for a lot of folks at the lower end of the income distribution were insufficient. Like talking to people I know work in the service industry in Toronto, getting the $2,000 a month in the CERB was great, but it wasn't enough to cover rent. So a lot of households were very challenged through the pandemic. Now coming out of it, a lot of people are finding jobs, but we're experiencing this period of very, very high inflation and rising shelter costs. And so people are coming up against this. And so people are feeling just squeezed when it comes to affordability. And it's very challenging, particularly for those folks on fixed incomes or who are lower income, even if they're working. And so it is a difficult time and a difficult environment to be in. I mean, I'd be curious to see how this compares to other periods. The closest that we had something similar was sort of the early 1980s or even maybe the 1990s when interest rates went up dramatically, and just see how households coped with it then, because it's a very difficult time for a lot of folks. There's no question.
Well, that was a terrible recession, and people lost their homes. Alberta particularly was full of stories because the oil industry collapsed at the same time, of people just walking away from their houses, despite us talking earlier about how people will do anything to stay in their houses. When they go that far underwater, people will just hand over the keys. So that was a terrible recession, but it felt like an aberrant to the norm, which is not how today feels to me, Randall. I just want to put this to you sharply, that I don't believe that our economic system can continue to throw off these increasingly unequal results and sustain itself over time. I feel like it needs some sort of Franklin Roosevelt type intervention to bring some equity back to this system, or it's just not going to have popular support over time. I mean, it's getting, I think Canadians think that if you work in a full-time job, you should have a reasonable life.
And I think that's a reasonable expectation. I mean, we've put out a couple of notes on the economics of youth recently, and a lot of these kids who are coming in, they're very concerned and have a lot of economic anxiety, right? Because they're coming out of school, they're doing a lot of things right, coming into a world where affordability is constrained. They don't know if they'll ever own a home, even though they have a full-time job. They're living with their parents or relatives in order to save up for that down payment, and it just seems so far away. And I agree, it's leaving people, people disillusioned. It's leaving people, and some young folks we spoke to talked about a sense of hopelessness to some extent, that it just seems too far out of reach. And that's something, the Economist has said when it comes to things like equality of opportunity, the American dream is alive and well in Canada, and I personally believe that in Canada we have much more opportunity than a lot of other advanced economies even. And I think that we need to make sure we protect that and ensure public policies are in place to make sure that we're able to continue to do that going forward.
Inequality is disastrous for a democracy, right? Well, even dictatorships, and this is why economists really started getting interested in this topic, but we were focused in on income inequality. Where we now need to move beyond income inequality and think about inequality overall. And when you start thinking about
you read Thomas Piketty.
Excuse me, I write this stuff.
I was just trying to pat myself on the back for knowing who Thomas Piketty was. Not that I've read it. It's that fucking thick.
I know. So, what we now need to realize is how much that the unfettered market is actually not aligned with the philosophy of economics, right? Economists will say in the free market, you can go out and sell your goods. You can negotiate prices and it'll all work out in the end. And if you want a different outcome, then government has to come in and address policies. What that ignores is the fact that we have inherent biases and discrimination that underline that transaction, that causes racialized Canadians, people with disabilities, all of these sorts of things, that they don't experience that market that high-income white men do, and who are primarily driving that narrative. So what I would say is, while everybody wants to blame capitalism, our problem is our market system is not functioning as we envision it. So it's not actually a market system. It's more like a pro-business with embedded hate and discrimination. And if we actually had a functioning market system economy, these are issues that really wouldn't exist. So the fact that inequality exists, that we have bias and discrimination, all of those things tell me that's not what we have. And we really need to start changing our mindset about the quote unquote free market. Because it doesn't exist. It exists for some people, but for a large portion of the population, and a lot of them are living in low income, it doesn't work because of these embedded functions of people who are making the market not work.
Interesting. Listen, what a stimulating conversation this was. I can't thank you both enough for being on the podcast today to talk about this stuff with me. I think we might have educated some people, might have confused some people. I don't know whether I think you cleared up some things for me and raised some other issues that I now have to ponder. So we'll have to have you back to work that out. This was a really fantastic conversation, and two people who are really at the top of their fields and know what they're talking about. So thank you so much for giving your time to this. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank everybody who watched or listened to this show. Come back next week for more Herle Burly, and of course, go Riders.